Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Equity in the Center's first ever Facebook Live. We're here today to talk about unpacking the use of the term DEI hire against Vice President Kamala Harris. I'm Suarez, President and CEO of Equity in the Center, and I'm going to toss it to my colleagues to introduce themselves. Andrew, you're next to me, so I'll toss to you.
Thanks, Kay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, probably morning for some of you. I'm Andrew Plumley, he, him pronouns. I'm managing director at Equity in the Center. Happy to be here today. Looking forward to speaking with you all. Erica?
Hi, my name is Erica Hines. Pronouns she, her, and I'm also a managing director at Equity in the Center. I would say that I'm excited to talk about this topic. I'm not going to go with excited. I'm going to say ready to talk about this topic. So let's get into it.
And thanks to all of you who are joining us today. I would describe myself as ready also. As you can see, I put on all of my pink and green and pearls to support today. So I'm trying to represent to the best of my ability. We thought we would start by talking a little bit about the why of this event, though I have the feeling that those of you who have joined us know exactly why it's important to talk about this topic. The phrase DEI hire has been used to undermine and marginalize folks of color and women and individuals who hold other historically marginalized identities in professional context to explicitly say that we are not qualified in a coded manner. And that's well known. But we wanted to talk about the term because it's been used increasingly publicly and in the news cycle in the past 2 weeks following the announcement of Vice President Harris as the presumptive nominee. And we published a blog yesterday on Equity in the Center's Woke at Work blog, a brilliant blog by our colleague Nikki Jogpal, which includes links to many resources on the history of the term, the implications of using the term, and materials to support folks in developing language to talk to colleagues about why it shouldn't be used. We'd like to begin by talking about definitions. Now, yesterday there was an interview at the National Association of Black Journalists conference, which has been going viral for a number of reasons. During that interview, the question, what does DEI mean? What is the definition of DEI was asked and answered to some extent, but we'd like to drill down a bit to get underneath the acronym because the misunderstanding and misuse of the term broadly is related to the challenges around the use of the term DEI hire. So I'll toss it to Andrew.
Awesome. Thanks, Kay. And yeah, in all of our work, obviously, language matters. And so when we're doing work around DEI or beyond DEI, we want to make sure that we're using the right terminology. So we wanted to share with you what our definitions are when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just so that we can understand that each one of those phrases or terms are actually different things, which I think is important to name and understand as well. So just really quickly, diversity, it's really the kind of psychological, it's really kind of,
You're back.
I'm back. Okay, great. It's diversity, really the psychological, physical, social differences that occur among any and all of us in the world. It's really not limited to anything, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, language, age, etc. Diversity just is a fact of the world. We're all different for a bunch of different reasons. So that's really what diversity is. When we talk about inclusion, that's really the act of creating environments in which any individual, any group can really feel welcomed, respected, supported, and valued, I think, to participate fully in whatever it is, whether that be in an organizational context, whether that be in a democratic context. So inclusion is really about embracing differences and offers respect in terms of words, thoughts, and actions. So that's really what inclusion is all about. And equity is really about outcomes. And so equity is about the mitigation and ultimate elimination of identity-based disparities that we see in the world. So when we're looking at any sort of social outcomes indicators, whether that be in education, housing, healthcare, policing, et cetera, we see disparities based on identity, and equity work is really about doing the work to make sure that we see no disparities based on identity when looking at any of those outcomes.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to toss it to Erica. Before I do, I just want to name something I'm sure many of us are aware of, but in terms of helping folks come up with language to talk to colleagues about why this term is not just problematic and rooted in bias, but factually inaccurate in terms of its suggestion that quote unquote diverse individuals are less qualified than in most cases the predominantly white or predominantly male individuals who have historically held roles. When you look at the data, so you could look at reports from Catalyst, things that McKinsey has released, in addition to other folks who've done research over the years. Individuals who are the first in their role or who represent a historically marginalized group holding a position that folks who look like them or hold an identity like them have not historically had are generally 2 or 3 times as qualified as their non-diverse peers. During the pandemic, I think it was in 2022, there was a study that came out and said that women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies have 2 or 3 times as much experience as their male peers when they first get the job. So male CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are actually less qualified in terms of their years of experience, the jobs they held immediately before going into the CEO's position than their female counterparts. So it would be helpful when advocating for equity or talking to folks about why this term is inaccurate to name that folks, I've been a quote unquote DEI hire in the past, are generally more qualified than their peers who are not from so-called diverse backgrounds. Erica, I'll toss it to you. I know you have lots to say, in addition to having done some great research on Black women thriving that helps lead the way.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I want to build on what you said. I think that there's also, what comes to mind, I don't know the exact new acronyms that are being suggested, but one of them by the other side is around merit. Like they want to change DEI to merit something, some other word. So I actually want to start there because I want to talk about how the idea of merit in itself is entirely subjective. And when we're using the term DEI hire, it's like that there's a lot of hidden message, but one of them is like doesn't merit this role, which is false. So adding to what Kay and Andrew said, I think we also need to understand that, and I'm going to say this, I don't actually like that we're in this position of having to defend, but I will say this, Black women are the most educated group in the workplace. That if it's not widely known to you, let it be known. We tend to continue to go back to school and have a number of degrees that we bring to the workplace. So if we are looking at the candidacy for Black women in any position of leadership or power, and we're thinking about, those things that we, those particular facets that we look at to see, like for qualifications or experience, like Black women bring those in droves. So I think what I would like to say is I'd like to bring maybe into this conversation, which is the idea of for a whole week, we had a conversation maybe going, or excitement around breaking the glass ceiling. And I think that what is what is happening around the usage of the word DEI hire is wanting to perpetuate the glass cliff, in that already sort of placing the potential presidential candidate in a place where saying that she will fail in this role. And so it's like pre sort of disposing that by using this term. So it is not just like the term DEI, it's like there's so many messages that are, dog whistles that go underneath that messaging. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to have more conversations.
Thanks, Erica. Andrew, I know you have thoughts in response to Erica's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously the kind of DEI hire has been in the lexicon now for years, and obviously it's used as a derogatory remark with really the underpinnings of that being all of the racist tropes that we've heard of and that have been around for centuries at this point, frankly. And I think we talked about what the DEI hire really connotes, which is really about being it's a tool that, and a language that's used to say someone is unqualified, that Black and brown people are undeserving of jobs, that Black and brown people and Black and brown women are taking these jobs from deserving white people, and mainly white men at that. And so, as we see with the backlash around DEI around the country, whether it be banning books that center Black and brown, LGBTQIA, people's history, to affirmative action, the affirmative action case in the Supreme Court, or something like we saw with that nonsense at NABJ. I mean, I think it's quite clear that the language around DEI has really become a part of the mainstream lexicon. And so I also want to tie this to something that I've been seeing in the work that I've been doing, which is that when we're talking about building a race equity culture, when we're talking about what it really takes to move through a learning journey and arc and building a culture that really supports everyone, one thing I'm seeing is that organizations, particularly new organizations in their DEI work that are trying to move beyond DEI to really focus on equity, is a lot of the times they're bringing in Black and brown people where the organization itself only sees the value of that Black and brown person only for talking about race and identity. And so we have to really move away from bringing Black and brown folks into organizations to talk about their own identity and race, and actually understanding that the value that they bring to organizations is much, much broader than that. They can be CFOs, they can be CEOs, they can be COOs, and they don't have to be only chief diversity officers. Not that those are bad positions, but we've got to move away from just valuing Black and brown folks in organizations to talk about race.
Thanks, Andrew. One interesting thing I'll sometimes do is go to a company, like a corporation, or sometimes a nonprofit or foundation's page, and take a look at the picture of the individual who holds the chief equity officer, or if we're talking about on the corporate side, the chief talent officer position. And those roles are disproportionately held by folks of color, by Black women, by folks who may identify as queer or as members of the LGBTQ community, because that's how it goes, aligned to the comment that you made, Andrew. One thing I wanted to note in terms of merit and affirmative action, and things that folks can consider saying in conversation with colleagues when this term comes up, is that the oldest form of affirmative action is white supremacy. And no one has historically questioned the qualifications of white male individuals who got jobs through family or other social connections. People who hold the socially dominant roles are presumed to be competent. There is an implicit belief in their capacity and competency to figure it out and grow into the role. So they are assumed to be capable of holding those top positions you were describing, Andrew, whereas we are presumed to be inferior by virtue of our like phenotype, whatever ability or disability we may or may not have. And it's important to say these things out loud as part of conversations with folks around this term and around the misunderstanding of diversity, inclusion, and equity as three distinct concepts, and around representation as the end and be all in pursuit of equity or justice. Because representation is the absolute least that you can do in pursuit of first inclusion, then equity. Justice is a long way off and involves reparation. And something to which most of us aspire. Some of us are beginning to do it in organizations. American society, the American government has historically struggled with reparation. Because it begins with an acknowledgement of fact, which is another challenge for America and for institutions. So I would encourage folks, to whatever extent they feel that they are comfortable doing so without repercussions professionally, naming some facts around how some of us are presumed to be capable and qualified and trusted managing wealth, managing large multinational corporations or foundations or making grants, and some of us aren't, and there is data to back that up. So you can look at the Race to Lead report or series of reports that's been dropped in the chat. The glass ceilings and glass cliffs report that came out earlier this year connects to what Andrew says around giving folks the top job, but then not necessarily resourcing folks in that role because their identity is presumed to be what they're going to lean into. So they won't necessarily get investment in executive coaching. They won't get the support that they need as a top executive to be successful. And they also are held, and women in for-profit contexts have also struggled with this historically. They are held to a much higher standard. They are held accountable and responsible for problems that predate their tenure. So it's helpful if you can, to the extent that it's possible without creating repercussions for yourself in a professional context, to name some of these things or lead with inquiry potentially. So why is it that you think this individual isn't qualified when they attended A, B, C, D schools, had this job before, and the last person who had this job, this is their resume? So why would you presume that this individual isn't qualified? But the underlying belief is that all of the exceptional roles that the individual held prior, they were also not qualified for those. So just acknowledging the broader system is helpful. Erica, you're nodding your head. What are your thoughts?
I mean, first I want to acknowledge everything that you said. And, my honest response is I was like, yes. And I also want to say to them, we are trying to break through a glass ceiling and you want to push this person off a glass cliff already. This does not make sense. And ask them why they want to do that. I think that there's also this piece around, I'm like appreciating leading with inquiry. I wonder about the question around confidence, because I mean, sort of like, I'm still getting to like what is underlying this. And it's not that I want to suggest to someone that you like say, oh, is it because you are afraid of a confident Black woman? Although you can say that if you choose to, that is on the table. But I do want to sort of just bring up for folks that tied up in the DEI hire piece is also a fear of a confident Black woman assuming a position of power, which when you look at the presidency, name me a presidential candidate and or president who has not been filled with ego and confidence about their abilities. So this piece around, I just think that there's, I'm not asking folks to necessarily get at every underlying issue around the use of DEI hire, but what I am saying is I think there's a lot of avenues in which to address this, and really, if you so decide to. It's not necessarily to like pick apart or influence, but I do think that there's an opportunity for us to, as we're having this conversation in race, and I mean what I mean is like presidential race, to also open up the dialogue to what is really being said and implied. I want to talk about, like, let's get to the implications, because where they want us to stay is like DEI, and it's like, no, there's a whole bunch underneath that.
Erica, I totally agree, and I think after listening to both you and Kay, I think another thing I would add is just and if you take a step back for a second and just look at who's actually using the phrasing DEI hire, what outlets, what media folks, and just, I mean, keep a tracker. What media outlets are saying that? How are they using it? What's the identity, or at least maybe have to make some presumptions, but what identities of folks are saying DEI hire in that derogatory way, and then who are they speaking about? And I think it's quite clear what they're trying to do to undermine the credentials and the experiences of folks of color. And I think that alone, I think just naming that is super, super helpful in letting people understand what's really happening underneath.
Thank you both. And we are coming up to 30 minutes, which was our goal for chatting today. And we want to turn to the comments a bit. So I do want to flag what EIC board member Geraldine Coffey noted in the comments about fear of what will happen when there is a Black woman president potentially, or when people of color or women assume these top roles, which have historically held a lot of power, and that power has been misused. And underlying the fear of the changes that are happening demographically in this country, but then specifically like the change in terms of the office of the president, the office of the president at other institutions, for profit and not, is a fear of how folks who have been historically excluded from systems of power will act when they hold the power. And so then we see what unfolded at the National Association of Black Journalists conference. We see the 80 plus anti-DEI bills that are now on the books across the country. We see language and a narrative around going back to the good old days, or going back to the way that things were, when people of color and women were much more tightly controlled in terms of what they could do in society by law. And that's another thing that you can name, Erica, without potentially asking folks to consider all the historical implications, but just something to point out, because the fear is real. And often in organizations, when they begin doing equity or DEI work, as most folks call it, there is a fear expressed around what's going to happen when the institution does the work, i.e., will I lose my job? Will we all lose our jobs because we're not diverse? Whether it's said out loud or not, that fear is there. And when you do coaching with folks or facilitate conversations about what's underneath resistance, it does rise to the top. Oh, and Viva, thank you. Just dropped a comment in the chat, like asking what the true opposite of a DEI hire is. Is it a legacy hire? Is it the boss's son or daughter or cousin? Are those folks really qualified? Because the running joke is that those folks also are not qualified, but they still get to run not just corporations, but countries. Ooh. Erica and Andrew, any thoughts on what's in the chat? And folks, please feel free to drop comments or questions, and we'll respond to them as we can.
I just want to say I love Viva's comment there. Like, what actually is the opposite? That's great. And I would love to hear what the response would be on that. I have asked something similar when working with higher ed institutions, and so they don't really have a great answer for legacy students, and they don't want to name that.
Those folks deserve to be there. They earned it.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Erica, what can you tell us about the path forward? So if we're in an institution that's doing DEI or equity work, like Equity in the Center just started a podcast that talks about going beyond DEI, and a lot of your work, your research on Black women specifically has looked at that. So as we are leading with inquiry and talking with folks about use of the term and what it means and how it lands and what's underneath it, what is a way forward or a vision that we can name, or recommendations that we can share to cultivate conditions in which individuals of diverse backgrounds, but in fact individuals of all backgrounds, can thrive in workplace contexts?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I think actually the first question is around the term thriving, and where does that fit in to how an organization and or a country sort of can move. So I think in terms of thinking about thriving in the context of having a diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment, let's use that as our little example here, is in addition to having a work environment that is inclusive and equitable, we also want people while we're there, while we're at work, to thrive. And so what does thriving look like? And I think like the path forward starts with actually imagining, which is actually taking place right now. I mean, I do think that people are like we're in this place because of national situations where we're imagining something that's different. So like, let's imagine what thriving could look like, whether it's in your life or whether it's in the workplace. And so I feel like the path forward is to imagine what that looks like, and then to figure out, are we there yet? And that's an oversimplification. But what I would say is one of the, a demonstrable way to move forward with thriving is, and I think that is apropos to this time period that we're in, is the idea, is three ideas. One is around connection and what truly creates connection, having discussions about trust and lack of trust, and how lack of trust shows up along race and gender identity lines in the workplace and in society. Like that is an uncomfortable conversation that needs to show up. So connection, trust, and I think it's also utilizing this word, which is also being commandeered, which is belonging. So what does it mean to belong? Suddenly has, and by suddenly that is me being sarcastic, suddenly has become a new word and a replacement word or an addition to work that we've done around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now it's about, well, everybody needs to feel like they belong. So I've been the one who's like, let's get underneath that. And so I'm going to get underneath why we have now started talking about belonging, and I want to bring it back to the path forward. Underneath that addition to belonging is actually white folks having hurt feelings and upsettedness about not necessarily being the status quo that we have moving forward, or even now. So it's like, I no longer feel like I belong. Therefore, let us now add belonging so that I suddenly feel like I can belong again. I want to talk about this idea of belonging in terms of a way forward, which is if we really are committed to everyone belonging, we are not committed to the status quo. Which means belonging does not necessarily mean comfortable all the time. It means a new way forward where we all feel that we can belong. So I know that that's a little bit roundabout. I also know that that was a soapbox, but I think that that's the pathway forward, in my opinion.
You touched on a lot of things. I want to name John Powell and the Institute, the Othering and Belonging Institute at Berkeley, which has a ton of excellent resources on belonging as he originally framed it, not the framing you shared that's us trying to get ourselves back at the center. So his framework speaks explicitly to dismantling structural oppression as a condition of belonging. And so I encourage you, when folks bring up belonging as a diversion, to bring them back via that route, potentially. Also, Erica, you named the lack of trust, and trust can sometimes, if the process is done well, be achieved through a process of healing. So I wanted to make sure that we named decolonizing wealth and share the steps that Edgar Villanueva outlined in terms of getting folks to begin to process how white supremacy shows up, not just in our society, but in our institutions as a mirror of society. And those links are in the chat. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
I would, Erica, that was great. And I totally agree with all of that. I think the thing that I just want to kind of name again is that oftentimes with this work, DEI, we're always talking about the things we haven't done or don't have. And it is, it's not framed usually with an asset base. And I do think that, Erica, what you mentioned about taking the time to vision what we want it to look like is something that I often see not a part of the process around moving beyond DEI. And that's the place where I think we actually have the least amount of practice, which actually I think is saying quite a bit, because we don't have the time to vision what we want it to look like. And it's always kind of in that negative based frame. And frankly, if we're going to be doing this work, we have to do the current work that's necessary, but we have to actually figure out what we want to replace it with together in community. And in order to do that, I think you also got to laugh, you've got to have a lot of joy, and you've got to have some hope. And those are the things that I want to bring to the work, that I think we all do bring to the work. And if you can vision together, then I think anything's possible.
Thank you both. I like that we're ending on a note that is hopeful and looking toward a future that we really have yet to imagine. I think some of our colleagues are in their work beginning to experiment with ways of being and doing and leading that will point us toward the future. But I thought of the future as you two were giving your kind of closing comments, and also when Claude dropped in the comments a note about sort of the legacy of savagery that this country has held, and that is related to the fear we're talking about. So as we look forward to a future we have yet to really fully envision in terms of its power and potential, but Erica, you spoke to it in terms of how folks are considering things in looking at Vice President Harris these past couple of weeks. What is before us in the future? There are leaders who will hold power without savagery. And so the fear is related to the fact that we have never seen the thing to which we aspire. So on a hopeful note, I hope we can all consider like the power that rests in that. So I think one of the unspoken hopes for a potential President Harris is how she could hold what is really the ultimate power without savagery and barbarism, but with abundance and healing. Hard to do given the history of this planet. And I think that is rooted in the hope and sort of the future that we're trying to encourage one another toward. So thank you all for being with us today. And thank you, Andrew and Erica, for being my favorite co-conspirators. Any closing words?
You ended perfectly. Absolutely.
Thank you. All right. Wishing everyone joy. Yes. Today and always. And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.